Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. We used a Ouija board to contact my dead grandfather. The person who answered isn't him. I'm not really the kind of person who believes in paranormal stuff. I mean, I'm not saying ghosts aren't real, but I never really had a reason to care either way. It's not like anything weird has ever happened to me before, at least not until recently. Now, I'm starting to wonder if maybe I should have just left things alone. Here's the thing. My grandfather passed away about a year ago. He was this no-nonsense kind of guy. Very practical, very grounded. But ever since he died, I felt like there was some unfinished business. I don't even know what, but something about the way he went, it didn't sit right with me. He was healthy one day, gone the next. The doctors called it a heart attack, but there was always this weird tension in the air whenever anyone in the family brought it up. Like there was more to the story, but nobody wanted to say it. Anyway, last Friday, my friend Jeremy came over and we got to talking about the deep web. You know, those creepy corners of the internet you always hear about but never really think are real. Well, Jeremy, being the impulsive idiot he is, decided we should check it out. I didn't think we'd actually find anything. We just thought it'd be one of those nights where we'd freak each other out and laugh about it later. So, we started clicking around, mostly coming across forums where people traded weird stories about haunted items or cursed rituals. It was pretty tame at first, but then we stumbled onto this one site, the Unseen Circle. The title alone should have been enough to make us stop, but curiosity got the better of us. It was this old-school, barely functional page with black text on a grey background. The kind of site that looked like it was made in the early 2000s. The first post that caught our eye was about communicating with the dead using Ouija boards, but not just any boards. These were apparently enhanced, created by someone claiming to have sacred knowledge passed down through generations. It was all probably a scam to sell cheap knockoff boards, but I'll admit, something about it pulled me in. Then I saw it. A post about contacting lost family members. You ever get that gut feeling that you should stop, but for some reason, you just keep going? That was me, right there. My grandpa popped into my head, and before I could stop myself, I said out loud, "What if we tried to talk to him?" Jeremy gave me this look, half joking, half serious. "Dude, why not? We can get a board at any party store." I laughed it off like it was no big deal, but in the back of my mind, the idea started festering. The thought of getting answers, of maybe knowing what really happened to him. It was like a switch had flipped, and now I needed to try it. The next day, we went to the local shop that sold all kinds of gimmicky Halloween stuff year-round. You know the type, neon skeletons in the window, shelves full of tacky plastic vampire teeth, that kind of thing. We found a Ouija board near the back. It was dusty, probably hadn't been touched in years, but it felt heavier than I expected. Not literally, but like there was something attached to it. I know that sounds insane, but if you've ever been in a situation where things just feel off, you know what I mean. We took it back to my place, and I'll admit, part of me was excited. This could be a chance to say goodbye to my grandpa properly, to find out if there was something more than what we were told. Jeremy, on the other hand, was clearly just in it for the thrill. He set everything up in my living room. Lights dimmed, candles lit because he said it added ambience. It was so cliché, it almost made me laugh. Almost. We sat down, the board in front of us, and I suddenly felt this weird wave of doubt. But before I could say anything, Jeremy was already placing his fingers on the planchette. "All right," he said. "Let's get started." Looking back, I wish we hadn't. I wish we'd just left the board in that store, dusty and forgotten. Because what we contacted that night, well, it wasn't my grandfather. It wasn't human at all. So, There we were, sitting in the living room, candles flickering, Ouija board in front of us. I could feel this tightness in my chest, like something was about to happen. Not the good kind of about to happen either. The kind where your instincts are practically screaming at you to stop, and you ignore them anyway. Jeremy was still all in, of course. He had that stupid grin on his face, like this was some big joke, like we were just messing around with another internet trend. But I don't know, man. Something about the whole thing didn't feel like a joke anymore. We placed our fingers on the planchette, and Jeremy started asking questions in this exaggerated, theatrical voice, almost like he was mocking the whole idea. "Is there anyone here with us?" he asked, dragging the words out. At first, nothing happened. The room was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the house settling and the low hum of the fridge in the kitchen. It was almost peaceful. But then the planchette jerked. I'm not talking about a little shift like when someone moves it on purpose to freak you out. This was a sharp, deliberate movement. Jeremy looked at me, his face going from smug to surprised in about 2 seconds flat. "Dude, that was you, right?" he asked. But there was this edge to his voice now, like he didn't actually believe it was me. "Are you messing with me?" I shot back, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't. He looked almost scared. I was too, but I wasn't going to admit it. Not yet. The planchette hovered over the letters, slowly sliding toward Y. Jeremy chuckled nervously. "Okay, fine, someone's here. Let's get more specific." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. The room didn't feel peaceful anymore. The air was thick, heavy. It was like the temperature dropped a few degrees, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker. "Who are you?" Jeremy asked. The planchette didn't move right away this time. We just sat there in silence, fingers lightly resting on the board, waiting for something to happen. For a split second, I thought maybe it was over, that whatever was here had left. But then, slowly, it began to move again. G-R-A. I felt my heart skip a beat. "Grandpa," I whispered. My throat was tight, like the words didn't want to come out. It had to be him, right? Who else could it be? The planchette moved to Y again. I felt this rush of relief, mixed with something darker. It felt wrong, all of it. Like this wasn't how it was supposed to be. Jeremy raised an eyebrow. "Okay, let's see if it's really him. What was the nickname you used to call him?" I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to ask. I hadn't thought about that nickname in ages. It was something only I called him. Something he wouldn't have told anyone else. Not my parents, not my friends. Just me. If the board spelled it out, I'd have my answer. "What did I call you?" I asked, barely above a whisper. The planchette sat still for a moment. Then, almost reluctantly, it began to move again. Slowly, deliberately, it spelled out the name I hadn't spoken in over a year. Pop Pop. I felt my stomach twist. That's when I knew something was really off. It's not that it couldn't have been him. I mean, it should have been him. But something about the way the planchette moved. It felt cold, distant, like it wasn't happy to be talking to me. Jeremy grinned, but there was no excitement in it anymore. All right. So maybe it's real, or maybe you're just really good at freaking me out. Either way, let's keep going." I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. It's like once we started, there was no way to back out. We were in it now, and the only way out was through. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. The planchette zipped across the board, faster this time. D-E-A-D-I felt a chill run down my spine. Obviously, he was dead. But the way it moved, it felt like something was mocking me, like it was stating the obvious, but with this sinister undercurrent. "How did you die?" Jeremy asked. I could hear the tension in his voice now too. He wasn't having fun anymore. For a moment, nothing happened, just dead silence. Then, the planchette started moving again. W-A-T-C-H-M-E-I pulled my hand back. my heart pounding in my chest. Watch me? What does that even mean? Jeremy's face had gone pale. Dude, that's messed up. Like, what is he talking about? I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of joke? Was something messing with us? But deep down, I knew. This wasn't my grandfather. Not anymore. Or maybe it never was. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the hallway. We both jumped, turning toward the sound. My heart was in my throat, and Jeremy was already on his feet, looking toward the hallway like he expected something, or someone, to come walking out. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the planchette moved on its own, without our hands touching it. It slid across the board, spelling out one last word. Look. I froze. The planchette just sat there, on look, and every instinct I had screamed to not do exactly that. Jeremy wasn't saying anything anymore, just staring at the hallway like he expected something to walk out of the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out everything else. For a second, I thought maybe this was all in my head, that maybe we'd freaked ourselves out too much, and the noise in the hallway was just the house settling, nothing more. But then it came again. Another bang. Louder this time. "Dude, what is that?" Jeremy whispered, like talking too loud would make whatever was there hear us. Like it didn't already know we were there. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too busy trying to keep myself from bolting out of the room. The Ouija board was still on the floor between us, and it felt wrong to just leave it there. You hear stories, right? About how you're supposed to properly close the session, or bad stuff happens. At that moment, I didn't care about rules. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Jeremy stood up slowly, taking one cautious step toward the hallway, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't!" I hissed. Let's just end this. Close the board, say goodbye, whatever we have to do." But Jeremy wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the living room, his body stiff like he was bracing for something to jump out at him. I could see the fear in his face, and for the first time since we started this whole thing, I could tell he wasn't enjoying himself anymore. "Man, I don't think this is a game anymore," he muttered under his breath. No kidding. I reached out and put my fingers back on the planchette. "Goodbye," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing happened. The planchette didn't move. It just sat there, dead still. "Come on," I said louder, trying to force it to move. "Goodbye. We're done." But it was like the board wasn't listening anymore. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like something was pressing down on us. I could feel my pulse racing, my skin crawling with this strange, almost electric sensation. I wanted to scream at Jeremy, to drag him out of the room, but my voice caught in my throat. And then we heard it. This low, rasping sound from the hallway, almost like breathing, but not quite. It was slow, deliberate, like whatever was in there wanted us to know it was getting closer. "Jeremy," I whispered, "we need to go. Now." But he wasn't moving. He was just staring, eyes wide at the doorway. The shadows seemed darker than they had before, like they were alive, shifting and pulsing in the dim light. I couldn't take my eyes off it either. Something was there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. You ever get that feeling like someone's watching you, even though you're alone? That's what it was like, but multiplied by 10. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing just inside the hallway. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice cracking. Jeremy nodded slowly, his face pale. "What is that?" "I don't know, man. I don't know," I whispered, my heart racing so fast it felt like it was going to explode. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the planchette one last time. "Goodbye," I shouted, desperate now. But again, the board stayed still. The figure in the hallway shifted, like it was moving closer, but still too far in the shadows to see clearly. It wasn't natural, the way it moved. Too smooth, too silent. Every instinct in my body was telling me to run, to get out of there. But I was frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, the figure spoke. "I'm not your grandfather." The voice was wrong. Deep, distorted, like someone was speaking through a broken radio. It echoed in the room, making my skin crawl. Jeremy took a step back, his breath coming out in short, sharp gasps. What the hell is going on? I couldn't answer. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing fit. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The figure stepped forward, just enough for me to see its face, or rather, what should have been its face. It wasn't human. There were no eyes, no features, just a blank, shifting mass where a face should have been, like it was made of shadows that couldn't hold their shape. "Leave!" it rasped. "Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Jeremy by the arm and yanked him toward the door. He didn't resist. He was just as scared as I was, if not more. We bolted out of the living room, leaving the board and the candles behind, not even bothering to blow them out. We didn't stop running until we were outside, standing in the middle of my driveway, gasping for air. I looked back at the house, half expecting to see the figure standing in the window watching us. But there was nothing. Just my dark, quiet house, looking as normal as ever. "Dude." "What the hell was that?" Jeremy finally asked, his voice shaky. I didn't know how to answer. All I knew was that whatever we'd contacted, it wasn't my grandfather. It wasn't anything human. And it had told us to leave. The problem was, I didn't think it was finished with us yet. We stood in the driveway, our breath heavy in the cold night air. My heart was still racing. The image of that thing burned into my mind. Jeremy was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, while I just stood there, staring at the house like it was some kind of alien structure. It looked normal from the outside, but I knew better. Something was still in there, lurking in the shadows, watching us. "I can't believe that just happened, man," Jeremy finally said, stopping in front of me. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "That thing, what was that? That wasn't your grandpa. That wasn't even human." "I don't know," I whispered. "But it told us to leave. I think we should listen." Jeremy nodded, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to shake off the cold. "Yeah, no kidding. I'm never touching a Ouija board again. Ever." We were both rattled, but we were out of the house. We should have felt safer, but the truth was, I didn't. It was like an invisible weight still hung over me, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. My skin felt tight, like something was crawling underneath it, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that faceless figure standing behind me, but there was nothing there, just the empty street, eerily quiet. Jeremy must have sensed it too, because he suddenly stopped pacing and looked around, his brow furrowing. "Dude, do you feel that? It's like we're not alone." That's when I realized. The feeling, the heaviness, it didn't stay in the house. It followed us. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "Let's just get out of here, okay? Go somewhere. Anywhere but here." Jeremy didn't argue. We both practically ran to his car, and once we were inside, we slammed the doors shut, like that would somehow protect us from whatever was out there. Jeremy fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. Finally, he jammed them into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the front of my house. I half expected to see that figure standing there again, watching us from the porch. But the house just sat there, dark and silent, like nothing had happened. We drove in silence for a few minutes, both of us too freaked out to say anything. I could feel the tension in the car, thick and suffocating. My chest felt tight, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. The board, the voice, the figure. It all felt so unreal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. After what felt like forever, Jeremy finally spoke. Where should we go? I didn't know. Nowhere felt safe. My house was out of the question, and going to Jeremy's place didn't seem any better. We couldn't exactly explain what had happened, not without sounding insane. We didn't have many options. Let's just drive for a bit, I said quietly. Maybe we'll think of something. Jeremy nodded and kept driving, his eyes darting nervously between the road and the rear-view mirror, like he expected something to be following us. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. That feeling, the weight pressing down on us, it was still there. The further we got from my house, the more it felt like we were dragging something along with us. Like a shadow clinging to our backs, invisible but always present. After a while, we found ourselves on the edge of town, the streetlights becoming fewer and fewer until we were driving through near total darkness. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of trees as the wind picked up. I leaned back in the seat, trying to calm myself down, but the unease wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting worse. Then Jeremy slammed on the brakes, hard. I jerked forward, my seatbelt catching me just in time. "What the hell, man?" But Jeremy wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale, eyes wide in terror. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. The road ahead was empty, or at least it should have been. But there, standing in the middle of the street, was a figure, a dark silhouette, barely visible in the faint light of the headlights. It wasn't moving, just standing there, facing us. "No way," I whispered, my mouth going dry. It was the same figure, the one from the hallway. Faceless, featureless, just a mass of shadows that seemed to ripple and shift, like it couldn't hold its shape. "We need to turn around," Jeremy said, his voice shaking. But before he could move, the figure took a step toward us, slowly, deliberately. The headlights flickered, the engine sputtered, and my blood ran cold. "Jeremy, go!" I shouted. He threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching as we backed up, but the figure kept coming. It didn't run, didn't move fast, but it didn't have to. Every step it took felt like it was sucking the air out of the car, making it harder to breathe. My heart was pounding in my ears, my skin crawling with fear. We finally managed to turn the car around, and Jeremy floored it, speeding down the road like our lives depended on it. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure right behind us, but it was gone. The road was empty again, but that didn't make me feel any better. "It's following us," Jeremy muttered under his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "It's not going to stop, is it?" I didn't know how to answer that. Deep down, I had a feeling he was right. Whatever we'd contacted with the Ouija board, it wasn't tied to the house. It wasn't tied to the board. It was tied to us now. We kept driving, but no matter how far we went, the feeling didn't go away. That weight, that presence, it was still with us, like something had latched onto us, feeding off our fear. And then my phone buzzed. It shouldn't have. Not this late. Not after everything that happened. But I glanced down at it, hoping it was some mundane message that would somehow break the tension. It wasn't. It was from an unknown number. Just one word, all caps. "Look." I dropped my phone, my hands shaking. Jeremy glanced at me, his face even paler than before. "What? What's wrong?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed at my phone lying on the floor, the screen still lit up with that single terrifying word. Jeremy's phone buzzed too. He didn't even have to look at it. He knew. "Dude," he whispered, "what are we going to do?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever we had let in, it wasn't leaving us alone. It wasn't done with us yet. Jeremy's car sped through the empty streets like we were running out of time, which, to be honest, we probably were. My hands were trembling as I picked my phone back up, staring at the single word on the screen. "Look." I didn't want to. Whatever that thing was, It was still out there, and it wanted us to see it. But why? What did it want? "Where do we go?" Jeremy asked, his voice barely holding together. He kept glancing at the rear-view mirror, like he expected the figure to be right behind us again. But the road stayed empty, just a black strip cutting through the trees. The streetlights were long gone, and everything outside the car felt like it was closing in on us. I didn't have an answer. Every place that popped into my head felt wrong, unsafe. It wasn't just a place we could outrun this thing. I knew that now. It wasn't physical. It was something worse, something that had latched onto us the moment we opened that board. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice cracking. "But we can't keep driving. It's not going to stop." Jeremy didn't respond. He just kept driving, the fear in his eyes mirrored by the pit of dread growing in my stomach. We couldn't just keep running. We had to face it. But how? We didn't even know what it was. Then, out of nowhere, Jeremy slammed on the brakes again. The car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the pavement. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a second, I thought we'd hit something. "What the hell, man?" I shouted, looking around wildly. But Jeremy wasn't looking at the road. He was staring down at his phone, his face pale, his hands shaking. I got another message. I swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. "What does it say?" Jeremy turned the screen toward me, his eyes wide with terror. It was the same unknown number, the same single word, "Look." But this time, it wasn't just a text. Attached to the message was an image. I leaned closer, my stomach twisting with fear. The image was dark, grainy, like it had been taken in a hurry, but I recognized it immediately. It was a picture of us, me and Jeremy, sitting in his car. The headlights cutting through the darkness, our faces lit up by the glow of the dashboard. Except, the picture wasn't taken from inside the car. It was taken from the road, from right in front of us. "Dude, how did it take that?" Jeremy stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes darted to the windshield, and I followed his gaze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. There was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out in front of us. No figure, no shadow, nothing. But the picture had been taken just moments ago. Something had been standing there, right in front of the car, and we hadn't even seen it. "We have to get out of here," I muttered, the words barely making it past my dry throat. "We need to get somewhere with people." Jeremy didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, speeding down the road again. I kept my eyes glued to the windshield, half expecting that figure to materialize out of the darkness. But there was nothing. Just the suffocating feeling of being hunted, like we were playing a game where the rules kept changing, and we didn't even know what we were up against. The car's headlights flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through me. Jeremy cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. "This thing, whatever it is, it's not going to stop, is it?" I shook my head. "I don't think so." That's when I saw it. On the side of the road, barely visible in the darkness, stood the figure. Not in front of us this time, but off to the side, watching us as we sped by. Its head, or what should have been its head, turned slowly to follow the car's movement, its faceless void locked onto us. I gasped, pointing frantically. "There! Did you see it?" Jeremy glanced toward the spot I was pointing at, but it was too late. The figure was gone, disappeared into the shadows like it had never been there. Jeremy's breathing was coming in short, panicked bursts now. "What does it want? Why won't it leave us alone?" "I don't know," I snapped, my own voice on the edge of breaking. "But it keeps telling us to look. Maybe that's what it wants." Jeremy gave me a confused, terrified glance. "Look at what?" I didn't have an answer, but that word, it kept coming up. First on the Ouija board, then in the texts. "Look." It felt like a taunt, but also like a command. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the key to this whole nightmare. "Pull over," I said suddenly, my voice trembling. "What? Are you crazy? We need to get as far away from this thing as possible." "Just pull over," I repeated. "It wants us to look, right? Maybe that's the only way to stop it." Jeremy looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. But we couldn't keep running forever. He hesitated for a moment. Then, with a shaky breath, he slowed the car and pulled off to the side of the road. The engine idled quietly as we sat there in the darkness, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I was about to do, but I felt like we had no other choice. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I gripped it. "Stay here," I told Jeremy, my voice barely steady. "If something happens, drive. Don't wait for me." "Dude, no," Jeremy protested, his voice thick with fear. "You can't." But I didn't give him a chance to finish. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold night air. The wind bit at my skin, and the silence felt deafening. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, and then I turned to face the road. "All right," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm looking." For a second, nothing happened. Just the dark, empty road stretching out in front of me. I started to wonder if maybe I'd misunderstood, if maybe there was nothing to see after all. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, its form barely visible in the darkness, was the figure. Its body seemed to shimmer, like it was made of shadows that couldn't decide what shape to take. It was watching me, waiting. I swallowed hard, my entire body trembling with fear. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure took a step forward, its faceless head tilting slightly, as if it were considering me. And then, slowly, it raised a hand, a long, shadowy arm that pointed directly at the car, at Jeremy. "No!" I gasped, taking a step back. "Leave him alone. This is between you and me." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, arm outstretched, pointing at my friend. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it whispered, "You brought me here. Now look." I turned toward Jeremy, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it. Jeremy wasn't alone in the car anymore. There was a figure, another one, sitting in the passenger seat, its faceless form blending into the darkness. It turned its head toward me, and even without eyes, I could feel it staring. The last thing I heard before I blacked out was Jeremy's scream. The Ouija board told me my death date. It's coming true sooner than I thought. This all started as a joke. You know, one of those dumb challenges you do with friends on a boring Friday night when there's nothing else to do. We were all hanging out at my buddy Jake's place. Me, Jake, and a few others from high school that I'd kept in touch with over the years. We'd been catching up, talking about work, life, the usual. After a couple of drinks, someone brought up this old Ouija board Jake had in his attic. And like a group of idiots, we decided, yeah, let's do it. Now, I'm not really into that sort of stuff. Ghosts, spirits. It's not like I don't believe, but I'm more the better safe than sorry type. But peer pressure's a powerful thing, especially when everyone's laughing about it, daring you to try it. So, we dragged the board out and dusted it off. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The thing was creaky and worn, with the letters faded from age. The planchette looked ancient, like something straight out of a movie. But you know, we thought it was all in good fun. So, we dimmed the lights, because of course we had to make it extra spooky, sat in a circle around the board, and started asking it dumb questions. You know the kind. Is anyone here? What's your name? And who's going to be the first one to get married? Silly stuff. The planchette would slide around a little, but I was convinced one of the guys was moving it just to mess with us. Things got weird when Jake asked, "When will I die?" The planchette didn't move right away, and we all kind of laughed it off. "Guess even ghosts don't know that one," Jake joked. But then slowly, too slowly, the planchette began to move. We all went quiet, and honestly, I felt this chill crawl up my spine. It spelled out 2035. Jake laughed it off, saying it was too far away to care. He'd be like 40 by then, so who cared? But then he dared me to ask. I tried to shrug it off, but everyone was staring at me, waiting. "So," I asked, trying not to sound as nervous as I felt, "when will I die?" The planchette didn't hesitate this time. It slid quickly, more smoothly than before, spelling out a date. 2024. This year. I froze. Everyone went silent for a second, before bursting into nervous laughter. Jake made some joke about me watching my back, but I wasn't laughing. The air in the room felt off, like it had suddenly gotten colder. I could feel my heart racing. I didn't want to admit it at the time, but something about that moment got under my skin. I told them I was tired and called it a night soon after. I didn't think much of it the next day. Honestly, I didn't want to think about it. It was just a stupid game, right? But as the weeks went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Little things started happening that I couldn't explain. I'd come home to find my front door unlocked, even though I knew I'd locked it. Lights in my apartment would flicker randomly, and I'd hear creaks and footsteps at night when I was the only one there. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Things took a darker turn about 2 weeks after that night. I was out for a jog in the park near my place, just trying to clear my head. It was dusk, and the sun was setting, casting these long shadows through the trees. I had my earbuds in, music blasting, when I felt it. That weird sensation, like someone was watching me. I glanced around, but there was no one there, just me and the trees. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. I started jogging faster, convincing myself I was being paranoid again, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, just an empty park. My heart was pounding, and I could feel this cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I was just about to shrug it off when I saw it again, this shadowy figure standing a few feet behind a tree. It wasn't moving, but it was watching. I stopped dead in my tracks, pulling out my earbuds, scanning the area. "Hello!" I called out, hoping it was just another jogger or something, but no one responded. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, half hidden by the tree, barely visible in the fading light. And then, just as quickly as I'd noticed it was gone. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what I'd just seen. Maybe it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there. After that, things only got worse. I started having these vivid, terrifying nightmares. In them, I'd be walking through an empty house, and I'd find a door at the end of a long hallway. When I opened it, there was nothing on the other side but darkness. Every time, without fail, I'd step through, and I'd wake up gasping for air, feeling like I'd just narrowly escaped something. And then, about a week ago, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. Inside, there was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. It said, "I'm watching you." Now, I'm not one to believe in coincidences, but this wasn't just paranoia. Someone was out there, and they knew where I lived. I couldn't help but wonder, was this connected to that night with the Ouija board? Was this real? I thought it was a joke at first, maybe one of the guys from that night messing with me. But when I called them, none of them admitted to it. Jake sounded freaked out himself, said he'd been getting weird stuff happening at his place too. That's when I realized this wasn't just a game anymore. Something had followed us home. So, after the letter, things started to get way worse. I'm talking about real physical things happening now. No more creepy letters or unsettling feelings. This was different. This felt dangerous. The night after I got that letter, I heard scratching at my bedroom window. Not like a tree branch tapping or anything you could just brush off as nature doing its thing. No, this was deliberate, like claws dragging across the glass, slow and steady. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, staring at the window. The blinds were closed, but I could see the shadows moving behind them, like someone or something was pacing just outside. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. The scratching stopped, and for a second, I thought maybe it was over. But then I heard it again. This time, it was coming from inside the room. At that point, I was sure I was losing it. There was no way someone could have gotten into my apartment without me knowing, right? Still, I slowly turned my head, scanning the room. The only light was from my phone charger, casting this faint glow across the walls. And that's when I saw it. At the far corner of my room, near my closet, there was a figure. Not fully solid, more like a shadow, but darker. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I blinked, thinking it was my eyes playing tricks on me in the dim light. But no, it was still there. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at this thing, but it felt like an eternity. My body was frozen in place, heart racing so fast I could hear it pounding in my ears. I kept telling myself to move, to get up, to do something, but I couldn't. I was just locked in this weird, silent standoff with the shadow. Then, in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. Just like that. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. I sat in the dark for a long time after that, just trying to process what had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I was too afraid it would come back. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd been dreaming. I hadn't really seen anything. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, right? Lack of sleep, stress, that stupid letter. It was all building up. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia creeping in. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The following week, things started to happen more frequently. I'd catch glimpses of that shadow out of the corner of my eye when I was at home. At first, it would only appear in places where shadows normally formed, behind the door, in the corners of the room, under the bed. But then, it started showing up where it shouldn't be. Like, I'd be brushing my teeth in the bathroom, and I'd see it standing in the hallway, just out of reach of the light. Always still, always watching. I'd look, and it'd be gone. This went on for days, and I was starting to lose it. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I even stopped going out at night, which, for someone like me, was a huge change. Every time I left the apartment, I felt like I was being followed, like something was always watching from the shadows. I'd hear footsteps behind me, only to turn around and find nothing there. One night, about a week after the first shadow appeared, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I called Jake, desperate for some kind of explanation. I told him everything, the scratching at the window, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. I expected him to laugh it off, maybe try to calm me down, but instead, he got real quiet. "I've been seeing it too," he said, his voice low. "The shadows, they're everywhere." My heart sank. I wanted him to tell me I was crazy, that I was just imagining it. But if Jake was seeing it too, maybe this wasn't just in my head. He told me that a few days after our Ouija board night, he started seeing things as well. Not just shadows, but full-on figures standing at the foot of his bed. He said they'd whisper to him while he slept. Not words exactly, but noises, like faint whispers, in a language he couldn't understand. His house, like mine, had started to feel colder, darker. Even his dog, a big German shepherd, refused to go into certain rooms anymore, growling at empty spaces. That's when Jake dropped the bombshell. He'd been doing some research online, trying to figure out if there was something more to what we'd done that night. You know, looking up stories about the Ouija board, spirits, hauntings, all that. What he found, not comforting. Apparently, the board wasn't just a toy. Sometimes it acted like a door. And once you opened that door, something could come through. He said there were stories of people seeing shadow figures after messing with one. Figures that would follow them, feeding on their fear, getting closer and closer until... He didn't finish that sentence. I didn't sleep at all after that conversation. How could I? I kept thinking about the figure I'd seen in my room, about how close it had been. I started wondering how long it had been there. Had it been watching me for days, weeks? That night, I set up my phone to record while I slept. I wasn't really sure what I was expecting to catch, but I just needed some kind of proof. Something to either confirm I wasn't going crazy or help me understand what was happening. The next morning, I watched the footage. The first few hours were normal. Just me, tossing and turning, the sound of distant cars outside my window. But around 3 a.m., the temperature in my room seemed to drop, like you could actually see the air shift. The camera started picking up faint whispers, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. And then, at exactly 3:14, the camera glitched. For a split second, just before the video cut out, I saw it. A dark figure, standing right by my bed, staring down at me while I slept. I haven't been able to sleep since. After seeing that shadow on the recording, something in me snapped. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just paranoia or tricks of the light. Whatever this thing was, it was real, and it was getting closer. I started to feel like I was living on borrowed time. Every time I closed my eyes, I wondered if that would be the moment it finally reached me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was counting down the days to something. Something I wasn't ready to face. The worst part? I didn't know when it was coming. I had no control. Jake called me the morning after I watched the recording. He sounded rough, like he hadn't slept in days. "Dude," he said, his voice trembling, "we need to talk. It's getting worse." Apparently, the night before, Jake had woken up around 3 a.m. again, just like I had. But this time, it wasn't just whispers or shadows. He said he felt something, breathing on him, like it was hovering right above his face, waiting for him to open his eyes. He swore he didn't move for what felt like hours, too afraid to see what was there. When he finally did, he saw the outline of a figure standing in the corner of his room, watching him just like it had been watching me. He sounded desperate, asking if I'd found anything in my own research. I hadn't. Every forum, every paranormal subreddit was just filled with stories like ours. People messing with things they shouldn't, seeing shadows, hearing voices, feeling watched. But no one had any solutions. No one knew how to make it stop. That's when Jake dropped the second bombshell. "I didn't want to freak you out before, but I've been thinking about that date. The one the board gave you. 2024, right?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. "Well, I looked it up, man. Do you know what day it is today?" I glanced at the calendar on my phone. It was early February. I didn't understand where he was going with this. "Your date, man. It's only a few months away. We're in 2024 now." I hadn't thought about it like that. I'd been so caught up in the weird stuff happening around me. I'd almost forgotten about that stupid date the Ouija board had given me. It seemed so far away when we first asked. But now it felt like the clock was ticking. Jake went on, his voice shaky. "What if this thing, whatever it is tied to that date? What if it's waiting for something?" His words hit me like a truck. I hadn't even considered that possibility. But now, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was this shadow, This thing that had been following me, counting down the days to that date. Was that when it was planning to do something? And if so, what exactly was going to happen on that day? I didn't have any answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just sit around waiting for it to get me. I started sleeping with the lights on. It didn't help. I tried staying awake all night, but eventually I'd drift off and wake up in a panic, feeling like something was in the room with me. My apartment felt less like a home and more like a trap. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the air always felt thick, like I was breathing in something wrong. Every corner held a shadow I didn't trust, and every noise felt like a threat. But it wasn't just my apartment anymore. That was the part that scared me the most. One evening, I was driving home from work. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and the streets were mostly empty. I'd been feeling off all day, that same pressure building in my chest, the same sense that something was watching. As I drove, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see something in the back seat. I was about halfway home when I saw it, just for a split second. Something darted across the road, right in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, my heart nearly jumping out of my chest. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the spot where it had crossed. It was too fast to make out details, but it wasn't an animal. It was human-shaped, but darker than the shadows around it. I rolled down the window, scanning the road. Nothing. But the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got that same feeling I'd had when I first saw the shadow in my room. That icy, paralyzing sense that something was near. I floored it the rest of the way home, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. When I got home, the apartment felt different. It wasn't just shadows or flickering lights anymore. The air was so heavy it was hard to breathe, like walking into a room after someone's been smoking for hours. And I swear to God, there was this smell, faint but noticeable, like rotting wood or something decaying. I didn't want to be there, but I didn't know where else to go. I shut all the doors, turned on every light, and tried to distract myself with TV. But nothing worked. That feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and no amount of noise could drown it out. I was sitting there, trying to calm down, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "It's almost time." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I didn't want to believe it was real. But there it was, clear as day. I texted Jake right away, asking if he'd sent it, but he hadn't. In fact, he hadn't heard from anyone all night. As soon as I put the phone down, the lights flickered. And then, just like before, I heard it, the scratching. Not at the window this time, but at my front door. Slow, deliberate, like something was waiting. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I open the door? Should I call someone? But before I could even make a move, the doorknob started to turn, slowly, creaking as if someone, or something, was trying to come in. I backed away, my eyes locked on the door, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on me. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. I wasn't sure if I could handle it. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, coming from just behind the door. It whispered one word. Soon. After that night, everything changed. It was like the air itself was taunting me, reminding me that time was running out. I didn't sleep. Couldn't really. Every night, I'd sit in my living room, all the lights on, staring at the door, waiting, listening. It didn't matter what time it was, day, night, whatever. I could feel it. That thing. Always just out of sight, always just beyond the door or the window. The shadows moved when they shouldn't have, stretched farther than the light should have allowed. And I wasn't the only one seeing them anymore. Jake called me one morning, voice shaking. He sounded worse than I felt, if that was even possible. "I think it's following me to work now," he whispered, like he was scared someone would overhear. He told me he'd been seeing it during the day, out of the corner of his eye. Every time he turned to look, it would vanish, but it was getting bolder. He swore he saw it standing at the end of his driveway that morning, just standing there, watching. I wanted to tell him I believed him. I wanted to tell him it was happening to me too, but the words wouldn't come out. I think part of me didn't want to admit how real this had all become. Part of me was still clinging to the hope that this was just some elaborate trick. Or maybe my brain was short-circuiting from lack of sleep. But then the messages started again. Every night, around 3 a.m., I'd get a text from that unknown number. The first one just said, "Soon," same as before. The next night, closer. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the time I had left was shrinking, minute by minute. I started counting down the days in my head, wondering if this would be the day, wondering if the date the board gave me was a death sentence I couldn't escape. 3 days before the date, things escalated. It was late, and I was sitting in my usual spot on the couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. The lights were all on, but they felt dim, like they weren't doing much to push back the darkness outside. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming from the hallway just outside my door. At first I thought maybe it was a neighbor coming home late, but as the steps got closer, I realized something wasn't right. The sound was off, like whoever, or whatever, was walking wasn't trying to be quiet. Each step echoed through the hallway, unnaturally loud for a place that was supposed to be empty at this time of night. And it wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling that came with it. The air grew colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I sat frozen, staring at the front door, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside. I could see the shadows beneath the door shift, like someone or something was standing there, waiting. And then, a knock. Soft at first, just a single tap. Then again, a little louder. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just sat there, listening to the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The knocking stopped, replaced by a voice. A low, raspy whisper. "Let me in." The voice didn't sound human. It was distorted, like it was being dragged through static. It was almost familiar. The same voice I'd heard that night at my door. The same one that said, "Soon." I wanted to scream, wanted to call for help, but I couldn't make a sound. I just stared at the door, waiting for it to open on its own, half expecting to see that shadow slip inside. But nothing happened. The voice stopped, and after what felt like hours, the footsteps slowly retreated down the hallway, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even leave the couch until the sun came up. I was terrified that if I moved, if I so much as blinked, it would come back. That shadow, that voice, it was getting closer. It didn't just want to scare me anymore. It wanted in. The next day, I started packing. I didn't know where I was going or what I was planning to do, but I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. Every inch of it felt wrong, like it had been tainted by whatever was following me. Even in broad daylight, I could feel it lurking in the corners, waiting for night to fall. I threw everything I could into a bag, grabbed my car keys, and bolted. I didn't have a plan, just drive. Anywhere but here. But the second I got outside, I realized there was no escape. As I was loading my stuff into the car, I saw it. Across the street, standing perfectly still between two parked cars, was the figure. The same shadow I'd been seeing for weeks now. But this time, it wasn't in the corner of a room or behind a door. It was just standing there, out in the open, in broad daylight. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, its shape barely visible in the light, like the sun itself couldn't touch it. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no eyes, just this solid, dark form. And it wasn't moving, it was just watching me, waiting. I got into my car, locked the doors, and floored it out of there. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to get as far away from that thing as possible. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling didn't leave. I couldn't shake the sense that it was still following me. Every car that passed, every pedestrian, every shadow in the road, it all felt like it. I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you'd only stay if you were desperate. And I was. I checked in, didn't even bother unpacking, and collapsed onto the bed. My body was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I kept thinking about that date. I was only 2 days away now, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't going to make it. That whatever was following me had something planned. That night, the knocking came again. This time, it wasn't at my apartment door. It was at the window. The motel room was dark, save for the flickering neon sign outside. And right there, against the glass, was the sound of that same deliberate knocking. 3 slow taps, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. But the knocking came again, louder this time. And then, from the other side of the window, I heard the voice. Let me in. I didn't know how long I lay there, staring at the window. The voice, it was clearer now, like it was right there, just inches away from me. I could feel its presence pressing against the thin glass, almost like it was testing the barrier. Each word it spoke was heavier than the last. Let me in. I stayed frozen, clutching the bedsheets in my hands, heart pounding so hard I thought my chest might burst. I knew if I so much as moved, it would get worse. But I couldn't stay like that forever. My body was shaking, the tension unbearable. Then it spoke again. This time, it didn't knock. I know you're there. It wasn't even a question. It knew. It had always known. Somehow, this thing had been one step ahead of me the whole time. The Ouija board, the shadows, the voice. None of it had been random. It had all been leading up to this. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, hands trembling. The clock read 2:57 a.m. 3 minutes until that dreaded 3 a.m. mark. 3 minutes until the exact date the board had predicted. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The room was small, cramped, and every corner felt like it was crawling with unseen eyes. I wanted to believe that leaving my apartment, driving to this rundown motel, would have given me a chance to escape, but deep down, I knew better. This thing wasn't tied to my apartment, it was tied to me. The seconds ticked by slowly, agonizingly. The voice outside had gone quiet, but that didn't comfort me. I could still feel it, waiting, watching. At exactly 3 a.m., the room went cold. I'm not talking about a normal chill. This was something else. It was as if the air had been sucked out, leaving this biting, unnatural cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky clouds, and the thin motel blankets did nothing to stop the shivering. Then, the lights went out. The neon sign outside flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into total darkness. I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. The only sound was my breathing, ragged and uneven, and the slow, soft creak of something shifting outside the window. I held my breath. I knew it was there, waiting. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of the window latch sliding open. My heart sank, slowly, painfully slowly. I turned my head toward the window. The darkness was so thick that I couldn't see anything, but I heard the window inch open. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it that same sickening, rotting smell from before. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to stay still as whatever was out there crawled inside. The silence was broken by a whisper, so close it felt like it was coming from right beside me. "You can't run." I felt a weight on the bed, the mattress dipping as something unseen climbed onto it. The air grew colder, and I could hear it breathing, slow and deliberate. It felt like it was right behind me, crouching just inches away, My entire body was locked in place, my muscles screaming to move, but I couldn't. It was as if that thing had paralyzed me, trapping me in my own fear. Then, it spoke again, only this time. It wasn't outside. "I'm here." It felt like ice had been poured into my veins. I could hear it now, the soft creak of the bed, the slow shift of something moving closer and closer. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there, hovering right behind me. I could feel its presence, this suffocating heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The whisper came again, this time right next to my ear. "Look." I don't know how I managed to do it, but I forced myself to turn, slowly, painfully, until I was facing the other side of the bed. And there it was, the shadow. It wasn't just a dark figure this time. It had taken shape, something far more solid than I'd ever seen before. Its form was tall, looming over the bed, and even though it was dark, darker than anything I'd ever seen, I could still make out the faintest outline of a face. But it wasn't human. The eyes, they were just hollow voids, empty, but somehow staring right into me. Its mouth was twisted into this grotesque, almost amused grin. And then it whispered, "It's time." The room felt like it was collapsing around me, the walls closing in as this thing leaned closer, its face inches from mine. I could hear that static-like sound again, the same one I'd heard in my nightmares, the same one that had haunted me ever since that night with the Ouija board. It was getting louder, filling my head, making it impossible to think. I tried to scream, tried to move, but it was too late. The thing reached out, its hand, if you could even call it that, stretching toward me, fingers long and thin, more like claws than anything human. They brushed against my skin, and I felt a searing, freezing pain shoot through my body. And then, everything stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no cold, no pain. Just this deafening silence that stretched on and on. I thought I was dead. Maybe I was. I didn't know anymore. But then, I opened my eyes. The room was empty. The shadow was gone. The air was still cold. The lights still out. But I was alone. I sat up, my body aching, my head spinning. I glanced at the clock. 3:15 a.m. The date had come and gone, and I was still alive. But something was different. The room felt wrong. My body felt wrong, like I was still trapped in that moment, like I hadn't fully escaped. The shadow might have left, but its presence lingered, clinging to me, watching me. I could still feel it. I checked out of the motel at dawn, not caring where I went, just knowing I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. But no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. The date the Ouija board gave me was supposed to be the end, but maybe it wasn't a countdown to my death. Maybe it was just the beginning. And now, every night, at exactly 3 a.m., I hear it again. The knocking. It hasn't gone away. And this time, I'm not sure I'll be able to keep it out. We asked the Ouija board who was haunting our house. It told us to get out, and now we can't leave. I never believed in any of that supernatural stuff. Ghosts. Nah. Demons. Please. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love watching horror movies, but they always felt like, well, movies. Just fiction. Something to give you a quick thrill, maybe make you jump, but nothing that actually happens in the real world, right? That's why when my roommates and I decided to pull out a Ouija board last weekend, I thought it was going to be hilarious. Something to do while we were bored on a Friday night. The board wasn't even ours. We found it buried in the back of one of the closets when we moved into the house a few months ago. It looked old, like really old. The box had faded, torn edges, and the planchette was chipped on one side. But we figured, why not? It's probably just some creepy thing someone left behind. Seemed harmless enough. We weren't prepared for what actually happened. So, let me set the scene. There's me, Matt, my two roommates, Jenna and Kyle, and Jenna's boyfriend Chris, who was visiting for the weekend. It was around midnight, and we were all pretty buzzed, just hanging out in the living room. The lights were dim, and Kyle had lit a couple of those cheap candles you get at the dollar store because he thought it would set the mood. Looking back, that might have been the first mistake. You know how everyone always says that messing with stuff like a Ouija board is asking for trouble? Well, we didn't care. We sat in a circle around the board. Jenna, being the most into witchy stuff, decided she'd take the lead. She placed the planchette in the center and explained the rules. Don't take your fingers off the planchette, don't ask dumb questions, and always say goodbye at the end. I rolled my eyes because it sounded like she'd rehearsed that from some cheesy horror flick. We started with the typical stuff. Is anyone here with us? Jenna asked in this super serious voice that made Kyle laugh. Nothing happened at first. The planchette just sat there, still as a rock. No surprise. Chris, being the skeptic, started mocking it, whispering, "Ooh, spooky," while waving his hands in the air. We all laughed. But then, the planchette moved. It wasn't a big dramatic movement or anything, just a slight twitch at first. I figured Jenna or Kyle was messing with us, trying to get a reaction. But then it slid more, almost deliberately, right toward the word yes. Now, I still wasn't convinced. I mean, it's easy to fake that stuff if you're not paying attention, right? Jenna, on the other hand, looked kind of freaked out, but also intrigued, like she was really buying into it. She asked, "What's your name?" For a second, the planchette didn't move. I was about to make some smart-ass comment when it jerked again, this time more forcefully. It started spelling out letters, slow, shaky, but clear enough for all of us to read. T-A-R-A. None of us knew anyone named Tara, but I could feel the mood in the room shift. Kyle tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a coincidence, but his voice was a little strained, like he wasn't so sure anymore. Jenna asked, "Tara, are you the one who's been making the noises in the house?" Now, before this, I hadn't really thought much about the weird stuff that had been happening lately. You know how when you move into a new place, especially an old one like this, you hear creaks and random noises at night. That's just part of living in a house with history. But there had been some weird things. Footsteps when no one was upstairs. Doors that we swore were closed swinging open on their own, stuff like that. I figured it was the wind or the house settling. When Jenna asked the question though, the planchette shot over to yes, fast. That's when the air in the room started to feel heavier. I'm not trying to be dramatic, but it was like everything got weirdly still. No one was laughing anymore, that's for sure. Even Chris, the guy who was cracking jokes earlier, had gone pale. He whispered, "Ask it why." Jenna swallowed, glancing at me and Kyle for approval. We both shrugged, like, whatever, just go for it. What was the worst that could happen? It's just a board game, right? "Why are you haunting this house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette moved again, slower this time, spelling out the word D-E-A-D. That's when I started feeling a little weird. Jenna's hand was shaking, and she let out this nervous laugh. "Okay, that's enough for me," she said, starting to lift her fingers off the planchette. But before she could, it snapped back to life, moving so fast that it made this scraping noise on the board. It spelled out G-E-T-O-U-T. "Is this a joke?" I asked, looking around at everyone. But Jenna and Kyle looked genuinely scared. Even Chris was dead silent. The room seemed colder. We were all sitting there, frozen, staring at the board like idiots. My heart was racing, but I didn't want to admit it. I mean, this couldn't be real. Ouija boards don't actually work. At least, that's what I thought. "Maybe we should say goodbye now," Kyle suggested, his voice cracking just a little. Jenna nodded quickly and moved the planchette to the word goodbye. We all sat there in silence for what felt like forever. Then, Suddenly, one of the candles blew out on its own. I wish I was making that part up, but it happened right in front of us. Chris jumped to his feet, muttering something about how this wasn't funny anymore. I was about to agree with him when Jenna gasped, her eyes wide. She was staring past us, toward the hallway that led upstairs. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I didn't hear anything at first, but then faintly I could make out the sound of something moving upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking from room to room. The problem was, no one else was up there. You know that feeling you get when something is seriously wrong, but you can't quite explain why. That's exactly what hit me the moment those footsteps started. My brain was trying to come up with some kind of logical explanation. Maybe one of the neighbors was upstairs, or maybe the house was just creaking. But deep down, I knew. We all did. No one was supposed to be up there. We sat there in this weird, frozen silence, listening. The footsteps didn't stop. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing. Heavy footsteps too. Definitely not the sound of a house settling or pipes creaking. It was like boots thudding on the wooden floor above us. "Chris," Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. "Did you lock the front door?" Chris didn't answer at first. He was still staring at the hallway, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, I did." He didn't sound too sure. Without thinking, I stood up and grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight. I don't know why I thought that would help, but in the moment, I felt like I had to do something. "I'm going up there," I said, my voice way more confident than I actually felt. Jenna shot me this look, her eyes wide. "Matt, are you insane? What if—" But I was already moving. I wasn't going to let some weird noises freak me out in my own house. This was supposed to be just a dumb game, and I was determined to prove it. Besides, the whole footsteps upstairs thing, it had to be a prank. Maybe Chris or Kyle set this whole thing up to mess with us. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. I started up the stairs, the beam of my phone's light bouncing in front of me. Each step creaked under my weight, echoing way louder than I expected. The air felt thick, like walking through a fog almost. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, but I kept going. Behind me, I could hear Jenna whispering something to Chris, but I couldn't make out the words. I was too focused on the hallway at the top of the stairs. When I reached the landing, I paused. The house was dead silent again, except for this faint, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't mechanical, like a fridge or something. It was more like, I don't know, like the air itself was buzzing. My skin prickled, and I had this sudden, intense urge to turn around and go back downstairs. But my pride, or maybe stupidity, kept me moving. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs, ours, a guest room, and an office that we barely used. All the doors were slightly ajar, like we'd left them. Except one. The door to the guest room was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges, even though I swore it had been closed earlier. I could feel the cold draft coming from it, like someone had left a window open, but all the windows were shut when we checked earlier. The hallway felt wrong, like I was walking into someone else's space, and every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there. Still, I stepped closer, my flashlight pointed straight ahead. The guest room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but I could make out the vague shapes of the furniture inside, bed, dresser, that sort of thing. Nothing looked out of place, but something was off. I could feel it. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint, but clear enough to send chills crawling up my spine. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was low, like someone was talking just below the range of hearing, right behind the door. I froze. My hand was gripping the phone so tight that my knuckles ached, and my heart was hammering in my chest. I stood there, trying to listen, trying to understand what it was saying, but I couldn't. It was just a constant murmur, almost like it was in a language I didn't know. Behind me, I heard the stairs creak. I whipped around, half expecting to see Chris or Kyle following me, but the hallway was empty. And that's when I realised the footsteps had stopped. That cold draft from the guest room seemed to get colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few seconds. I heard Jenna call my name from downstairs, but it sounded far away, like she was calling from the other end of a tunnel. I took a deep breath, my pulse racing, and stepped toward the guest room. I don't know what I thought I was going to find. Maybe I was still trying to convince myself that this was just a trick. But the second I crossed the threshold into that room, my phone flickered. The flashlight blinked out for half a second, then came back on. And then I saw it. It was faint, barely visible in the dark corner of the room. But I swear to God, there was a shape, a figure, standing in the corner, pressed up against the wall. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. It was like my body locked up, like I couldn't move or scream or do anything. I just stood there, frozen in place, staring at this shadow that shouldn't have been there. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The flashlight flickered again, and the room was empty. Whatever, or whoever I thought I'd seen, it was gone now. But the feeling remained, like something was still there, hiding, waiting. I backed out of the room slowly, never taking my eyes off that corner, even though I couldn't see anything anymore. I practically ran down the stairs, my heart slamming in my chest. Jenna and Chris were waiting at the bottom, both of them wide-eyed, clearly freaked out. "What happened?" Jenna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to explain it. I saw something, I muttered, trying to catch my breath. In the guest room. I don't know. It was just, something was there. Before anyone could respond, we heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't upstairs. They were coming from the hallway behind us. All three of us spun around at the same time, staring at the entrance to the kitchen. The sound was unmistakable now. Slow, heavy footsteps, dragging along the floor. Closer, getting closer. Kyle was still sitting in the living room, his face pale, his eyes darting between us and the hallway. "Guys," he whispered, "what the hell is going on?" Before anyone could answer, the kitchen light flickered once, then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, except for the weak beam of my phone flashlight. That's when we heard it. The low whispering, the same one I'd heard upstairs. This time, it was louder, surrounding us, like it was coming from the walls themselves. Jenna grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We need to get out of here, now!" I didn't argue. None of us did. We ran for the front door, Chris yanking it open. But when we stepped outside, something stopped us dead in our tracks. The entire street was shrouded in thick fog, so dense we couldn't even see the house across the road. And in the middle of the fog, standing just a few feet from our front porch, was a figure. Tall, unmoving, its outline barely visible through the mist. We froze. The door slammed shut behind us, and the figure stepped forward. I don't know what I was expecting when we stepped outside, but it wasn't that. The fog was thick, unnaturally thick. It was the kind of fog that swallows everything around you, turning familiar places into something completely alien. Our street, which was normally lined with parked cars and the occasional porch light, looked more like some forgotten corner of a nightmare. Everything was muffled, even our breathing. But the figure, that was the worst part. It was just standing there in the middle of the street. Tall. Too tall to be a person, like it didn't quite belong. It didn't move, didn't sway or shift like a person trying to figure out which way to go. It was still, watching, and it was just close enough that we could make out its silhouette. Long limbs, narrow head. Something about its shape was wrong. Like it was twisted, slightly off, like the angles of its body weren't quite what they should have been. None of us said anything. We couldn't. I don't think any of us even breathed for a few seconds. I could feel Jenna's nails digging into my arm again, but I didn't shake her off this time. We all just stared, frozen in place. My phone light, weak as it was, did nothing to cut through the fog. The streetlights were out too, which made everything worse. The only thing I could hear was the soft sound of the fog swirling around us, and the quiet hum of that damn whispering, still following us even out here. Then, it started to move. At first, it was just a twitch, a small jerking motion, like it was testing its limbs, figuring out how to be. The thing took a step forward, if you could even call it a step. It kind of shuffled, its long legs dragging through the fog, but with an unnatural smoothness. Not like someone walking, but more like something gliding, like it wasn't even touching the ground. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to say something, tell everyone to run, but my throat had closed up. My feet felt glued to the porch, my body refusing to move. It was like my brain hadn't caught up with the danger yet, even though every part of me was screaming that something was very wrong. Jenna was the first to break the silence. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, barely audible. Her voice was so small, like she didn't want to be heard by whatever was out there. None of us answered. We didn't know. It kept coming closer, its shuffling movements faster now, more confident. The closer it got, the more I realized something else. There was no sound, no footsteps, no crunch of gravel, nothing. Just that sickening whisper, growing louder as it approached. And then I saw its face, or where its face should have been. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank, smooth surface, like someone had erased every feature and left behind a hollow, empty void. The skin, or whatever it was too pale, almost grey, like decaying flesh. My stomach lurched at the sight of it. It was wrong. So horribly, horribly wrong. And still, it moved toward us. Kyle was the first to snap out of it. Without warning, he bolted. He didn't say a word, didn't even look back. He just took off running into the fog, heading down the street, away from the house, away from it. The rest of us were too stunned to react right away, but that moment of panic snapped something in me. I grabbed Jenna's hand, pulling her back toward the house. Chris was already fumbling for the doorknob behind us, his hands shaking so badly that he couldn't get a grip. "Get inside," I shouted, finally finding my voice, though it sounded distant and shaky, like it wasn't even me speaking. "Now!" We stumbled back onto the porch as Chris managed to throw the door open. Jenna and I practically fell through the doorway, Chris slamming it shut behind us. The house felt like a prison, but it was better than being out there with whatever the hell that thing was. I ran to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peek out. The fog was still there, but the figure was gone, vanished, like it had never been there in the first place. "Where's Kyle?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. "Where did he go?" We all stared out into the fog, hoping, praying, that we'd see him running back toward the house. But he was gone, completely swallowed by the mist. "We have to go find him," Chris muttered, pacing back and forth, his hands in his hair. "He's out there with that thing." "I'm not going out there," Jenna whispered, sitting down hard on the couch, her face pale and terrified. "I'm not going back out there." She wasn't wrong. Everything in me screamed that we shouldn't go back outside. But Kyle was our friend. We couldn't just leave him out there. He was probably scared out of his mind, running around blindly in the fog. Maybe he'd come back on his own. Maybe he'd find his way. But something about the fog felt wrong. Like once you were out there, you weren't coming back. "We'll wait a minute," I said, trying to sound calm even though my hands were shaking. "He'll probably show up. Maybe he ran to the neighbors or something." We all knew I was lying. Minutes passed. The fog outside seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows, as if it was trying to creep its way inside. The house was eerily quiet, except for the sound of our nervous breathing. The whispering had stopped, but the silence felt worse. I glanced down at my phone. No signal. Of course. I tried dialing Kyle's number anyway, but the call wouldn't go through. No Wi-Fi either, even though we'd had a solid connection all night. It was like something was cutting us off from the outside world. "We can't just sit here," Chris muttered, his voice rising with panic. "Kyle's out there. We have to do something." Jenna shook her head, hugging her knees to her chest. What if that thing's still out there? We can't..." Before she could finish, there was a loud bang on the front door. All of us jumped to our feet. The bang was followed by another, and another. Like someone, or something, was pounding on the door, demanding to be let in. "Kyle!" Chris shouted, rushing toward the door. "Kyle, is that you?" He reached for the knob, but I grabbed his arm, stopping him before he could open it. "Wait," I said, my voice low, barely a whisper. "What if it's not him?" Chris froze, his hand inches from the door. The banging continued, louder now, more frantic, and then we heard it. A voice, but not Kyle's, not anyone's voice we recognized. It was garbled, distorted, like a recording played backward at half speed. The words didn't make sense, but the tone was pleading, desperate. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to mimic a person, but didn't quite understand how. "Open the door," it said. "Let me in. Let me in." Chris stumbled back, his face pale, his hands shaking. "That's not Kyle." Jenna was already backing away, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is happening?" The banging stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then, from outside, we heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, dragging across the porch. It was still out there. And it wasn't alone. From the window, I could see more shadows moving through the fog. Dozens of them. They were all around the house, their outlines barely visible in the thick mist. But I knew they were there, watching us, surrounding us. We were trapped, and I had no idea how we were going to get out. We didn't know what to do. There's something deeply terrifying about realizing you're trapped, and that's exactly what hit me in that moment. The fog outside, the figures shuffling around in it, the banging on the door. It all felt like a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. No one was thinking straight. The logical thing would have been to call for help, but our phones were dead. No service. The Wi-Fi was down. It was like the house was cut off from everything. I paced back and forth in the living room, trying to think of anything we could do. Chris was standing near the window, staring out into the fog, his face pale, his hands gripping the windowsill so hard his knuckles were white. Jenna hadn't moved from the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest. She kept glancing at the front door like she expected it to burst open any second. "I'm going out there," Chris said suddenly, his voice tight. I stopped pacing and turned to him. "What? Are you crazy?" "He's out there, Matt," Chris shot back. "Kyle's out there and we can't just..." "Did you hear that voice?" I interrupted, pointing to the door. "That wasn't Kyle. Whatever's out there, it's not him." Chris shook his head, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't believe what he was saying any more than I did. "We can't just leave him out there." I was about to argue when there was a noise from upstairs. A soft creak, like someone was walking around. We all froze. Jenna's eyes snapped up to the ceiling, her face pale. "You guys hear that?" There it was again. Footsteps. This time, it wasn't the slow, heavy dragging sound we'd heard outside. These were light, almost careful, like someone, or something, was moving around upstairs, trying not to be heard. "Maybe it's Kyle," Jenna whispered, standing up slowly. "Maybe he came back in through a window or something." I glanced at Chris, and he nodded, though I could tell he wasn't convinced either. The thought of Kyle sneaking in while we were distracted seemed unlikely. But what other option did we have? I grabbed the heavy flashlight we kept near the door, clicking it on. "Stay here," I told Jenna. "We'll check it out." Chris and I exchanged a look before heading toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. The air seemed thicker up here too, like the fog outside had somehow crept into the house. The shadows in the hallway seemed to twist and stretch in ways that didn't make sense, warping under the faint light of my phone's flashlight. The footsteps had stopped by the time we reached the top, and the silence was deafening. I glanced down the hallway, expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the noise. But everything looked normal. The guest room door was closed again, though I was sure it had been open earlier. The other two doors were still slightly ajar, like we'd left them. "Maybe it was nothing," Chris whispered, though his voice was shaking. But we both knew it wasn't nothing. The house had rules, and we had broken them. I didn't want to say it out loud, but I could feel it in my bones. It was like something had woken up in the house when we messed with that board, something that wasn't going to leave us alone now. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. The longer the silence dragged on, the worse it felt. My skin was crawling, like someone was watching us, even though the hallway was empty. Then suddenly, the door to the guest room creaked open. Slowly, like someone had pushed it from the inside. I aimed the flashlight at the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing, just the same empty room I had checked earlier, but it felt different now. The air in the room was colder, and the shadows seemed deeper, darker, like they were moving on their own. "We need to leave," Chris muttered, his voice barely audible. I nodded. Every instinct I had was telling me to get the hell out of that hallway, out of that house. But just as we turned to head back downstairs, the door to our bedroom slammed shut, hard. We both jumped, my flashlight flickering again as if the batteries were about to die. The noise echoed through the house, sharp and loud, breaking the oppressive silence. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. My hand was trembling as I gripped the flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness. Did you see that?" Chris whispered, backing away from the bedroom door like it might come alive at any second. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, we need to go. Now." We didn't waste any more time. We ran back down the stairs, practically tripping over each other in our panic. When we hit the bottom, Jenna was already on her feet, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. "There's something up there," Chris muttered, his face pale. "I don't know what, but..." Before he could finish, the front door rattled again. This time, it wasn't just a knock. It was a full-on assault. The door shook violently, like someone was trying to break it down, the hinges groaning under the pressure. The banging was relentless, the same garbled, distorted voice screaming to be let in. Louder this time, more desperate. It was as if whatever was outside knew we were trying to escape. "What do we do?" Jenna cried, her voice cracking. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. And then, like a sick punchline to the world's worst joke, the power went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered one last time, then died completely, leaving us standing in the pitch-black living room, surrounded by the pounding on the door and the whispers that seemed to be crawling through the walls. I fumbled for my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but it wouldn't work. The screen stayed black, unresponsive. Chris cursed under his breath, pulling out his own phone, but it was the same. Dead. We were cut off from everything. "Check the back door," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we can get out that way." Jenna nodded, and the three of us stumbled through the dark, bumping into furniture as we made our way toward the kitchen. The pounding on the front door grew more violent with each passing second, but we forced ourselves to ignore it. When we reached the kitchen, I reached for the back door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, but it was stuck, completely jammed, like something on the other side was holding it shut. Chris tried too, pulling with all his strength, but it didn't move. "What the hell?" I muttered, frustration boiling over. "It was fine earlier." That's when we heard it, a scraping sound from behind us coming from the living room. Something was moving in there, slowly, methodically, and it wasn't at the front door anymore. "Matt," Jenna whispered, clutching my arm. Her grip was so tight it hurt, but I couldn't pull away. "It's inside." My heart sank. I could feel it now too. The oppressive weight of whatever had been banging on the door, whatever had been whispering to us from the fog. It was in the house, with us. We backed away from the door, huddled together in the kitchen. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, like it was moving toward us. I felt the cold, unnatural air press in around us, thick with that low, eerie hum we'd been hearing since the Ouija board. "We're trapped," Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. And he was right. We couldn't leave. Not through the front, not through the back. We were stuck in the house with whatever had made it inside. And then, from the darkness, the whispering returned. Only this time, it was right behind us. The whispering was right there, so close it felt like icy breath on the back of my neck. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, like the air had been sucked out of the room. All I could think was, it's here. Whatever's been watching us, whatever's been playing with us, it's in the kitchen now. Jenna whimpered softly, her hand gripping mine so tightly, I thought she might break my fingers. Chris was pressed against the counter, his eyes wide, darting around in the darkness, trying to find something, anything that made sense. But there was nothing. We were trapped. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor behind us. I still couldn't see it, couldn't even tell what direction it was coming from, but I could feel it. The kitchen felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, and the air was thick with that horrible, buzzing energy. And the whispers. God, those whispers. They were soft, just below the range of understanding, but insistent. It felt like someone was trying to force words into my head, trying to tell me something that I wasn't supposed to know, but it wasn't a voice. It was more like a presence, something ancient, something wrong. My skin crawled, and every instinct I had was screaming to get away, to run, but there was nowhere to go. Jenna tugged at my arm. "We have to do something," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We can't just stay here." Chris was breathing heavily, his back pressed against the sink. "The windows," he muttered, barely audible. "We can break the windows." It wasn't a bad idea, but when I glanced toward the kitchen window, my heart sank. The fog outside had thickened, pressing up against the glass like some living thing. There was no way we were getting through that, not without whatever was hiding in it getting to us first. And even if we could, where would we go? We were completely cut off, no phones, no connection to the outside world. For all we knew, the street could have been gone altogether. But we couldn't just wait to die either. I stepped toward the window, slowly, hoping to God that the fog wouldn't react. But just as I was about to reach for the blinds, the whispering stopped. The silence hit like a brick wall. It was so sudden, so complete, that it made my ears ring. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. And then, from behind us, the voice spoke. Not a whisper this time. Clear, loud, and unmistakably human. A woman's voice, soft but commanding, like she was standing right there in the room with us. "You should have listened." The voice was coming from the darkness. My heart jumped into my throat, and I spun around, shining my dead flashlight into the empty space behind me. There was no one there, just shadows, stretching unnaturally across the floor. The house felt wrong, twisted, like it was no longer the same house we'd been living in. Everything looked familiar, but off, as though it was being reshaped by something we couldn't see. Jenna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Who said that?" Chris looked just as terrified as we did, but he was backing away from the center of the kitchen, moving toward the hallway. "We need to get out. We need to..." But before he could finish, the house itself seemed to react. The walls groaned, like the wood and plaster were stretching, shifting. The floor under our feet creaked ominously, and I swore I felt something move beneath the floorboards, like something was crawling, just beneath the surface. And then the whispers returned, louder now, angrier. The door to the kitchen slammed shut on its own, and the windows fogged up instantly, making it impossible to see outside. There was no way out. It was like the house had decided we weren't allowed to leave. We had broken its rules, and now it was closing in on us. The air grew colder, sharp, like ice against my skin. I could see my breath in front of me, coming out in quick, panicked gasps. I turned to Jenna, who looked like she was about to pass out. Chris was trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It didn't even shake. Whatever was keeping it closed was stronger than any lock or bolt. "We shouldn't have done this," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. "The board, it warned us." And she was right. We had been warned. The Ouija board told us to get out, and instead of listening, we had stayed. We'd tried to play it off as a joke, but now it was too late. Chris turned toward me, his eyes wide with desperation. "Matt, help me!" He was still struggling with the door, his hands shaking as he yanked at the handle. I rushed over, grabbing the knob and pulling as hard as I could, but it was useless. The door felt like it was sealed shut, like it was part of the wall now. And then, from the other side of the door, we heard it again. The heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, and dragging. Whatever had been in the fog, whatever had been outside, it was in the house now. The sound echoed through the hallway, growing closer with each step. My stomach dropped as I realized it was coming for us. "Get upstairs," I shouted, already pulling Jenna toward the stairs. "Go, now!" We ran. I don't remember how we made it up the stairs, but the moment we hit the second floor, I slammed the door to the hallway shut behind us. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. I leaned against the door, panting, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the flashlight. Chris and Jenna were standing in the middle of the hallway, both of them staring at me, waiting for some kind of plan. But I didn't have one. There was nowhere left to go. Then we heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it wasn't just coming from one direction. It was all around us, seeping through the walls, rising from the floor. And in the middle of the whispers, that woman's voice cut through again, sharp and clear. "You can't leave. You're already mine." The hallway suddenly felt too long, too narrow. The shadows stretched toward us, creeping across the floor like they were alive, swallowing up the light. The door behind me rattled, and I could feel it pushing against the door, trying to get in. "Jenna," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Kyle's not coming back." She looked at me, her face pale, tears in her eyes. She knew it too. We all did. Kyle wasn't out there anymore. Whatever had taken him, it was coming for the rest of us now. And just as that thought hit me, the door behind me burst open. Something cold, freezing, wrapped around my ankle, pulling me backward. I screamed, clawing at the floor, trying to get away, but the grip was too strong. I could see Chris and Jenna rushing toward me, but it was too late. The last thing I saw before I was dragged into the darkness was their terrified faces, the hallway twisting and warping behind them, the house folding in on itself, like it was devouring us. And then, nothing. We never left. We can't.